So we're going to start with a synagogue in Syria. So various hands ruled the people at this time. Syria is going to change hands a number of times, especially at the end of the Roman Empire. Monotheism is growing, including Judaism and Christianity. Art is still produced, and likely we're seeing art commissioned by both pagan and Christian patrons. The art of late antiquity tends to be of Roman tradition, but differs in subject and function, and becomes the foundation of medieval art. Now, the reason we have this town, Dura-Europos, is because the town will be taken back by the desert and refound in about 1920. And what we're looking at is actually a synagogue with a biblical cycle of mural paintings. Now, something to understand is early on, it would have been very difficult, especially before the Second Jewish Revolt, to tell Christians apart from Jews. To an average Roman, this would have been like us looking at Islam and understanding the difference between Shia and Sunni. Because Christianity develops as initially a sect of Judaism and then becomes independent of it due to the Jewish revolts and the need to identify themselves separately from Jewish leadership. So when we're looking at this synagogue, you're seeing Old Testament scenes, some of which would be quite familiar to you. In the middle, we see a niche. This is where you would have the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. On either side, we have benches for the congregation, and the steps that seem to lead to nowhere would have been a pulpit. Now, at the time, these synagogues would have been quite small. They would have basically existed in people's homes because the Jews are being persecuted quite heavily by the Romans. In fact, they will be taxed by the Romans following the Jewish revolts. So, what we're seeing here is a series of scenes, everything from the Ark of the Covenant, the Temple of the Dragon, scenes from Exodus, scenes from Elijah, etc., all laid out on these walls. And the piece we're actually looking at is this scene where we have one man in front of the rest, obviously a teacher, existing within the rabbinical tradition of Judaism, teaching these other people. But what's interesting is they've taken on that Roman tradition that we've seen since the Tetrarchs. All of the figures are identical. All of their clothing, except for color, is identical. And we've backtracked a little bit. Suddenly we have hierarchy of scale, which is something that we wouldn't expect to see. At least not during the Roman period. So there's no volume or depth. The figures are very frontal, very simplified. There's no emotion on the face and no sense of movement or gesture. Now, in the same town, we have a Christian community house. In early Christian tradition, there are no churches, not until the acceptance by Constantine of Christianity. So they're meeting in usually one member's house that's been converted into what's known as a community house. And this is a Christian place of worship that would have held about 70 people in a remodeled private home. At the time, of course, Christianity isn't recognized, and the numbers remain very, very small. There's also a persecution ongoing under Diocletian, where we'll have about 20,000 Christians total killed in the empire, not generally, incidentally, in the Colosseum. Usually in the smaller cities, they're rounded up and killed in these cities or otherwise persecuted. Persecuted would be more apt because there's a lot of prison sentences, etc. And what we see is this reconstruction of this community house. We see a lot of small rooms, but there's one thing that really stands out. And it's actually in this room. And what we're going to be looking at is this lunette here, this arched wall. And I've got a better picture of that. We'll see that in a second. Beneath it, importantly, is a baptistry. So this is where you would baptize new members coming to the faith. And what we're looking at is this. This is an image from that lunette, and it should look oddly familiar, although I'm going to walk you around it just to help you out here. Here we have sheep, and we have a man, a shepherd, carrying sheep. You notice there's no halo, no long robe, no beard, no long hair, no sandals, but this is Jesus. This is Jesus being depicted as the Syrians would have recognized him, as one of them, not being depicted as a Western European. Those ideas will come later, and we'll get to them. Beneath him, we see two nude figures. We know they're nude from where they're covering, and we know, based on Christian tradition, they must be Adam and Eve. Behind them is the tree of knowledge, the tree from which Eve consumes a fruit. By the way, it's not an apple because there's no such thing as an apple in biblical times. It would have been a fruit, would be a better translation. So we see Christ as the good shepherd, based on Greek archaic art. This very simple deadpan form. We're not seeing a lot of detail there. He's not suddenly incredibly muscular or incredibly strong. So it creates a very interesting image. And a lot of those ideas that we're used to, the halo, etc., have yet to develop.